Hello everyone and welcome back to Uncommon Sensibilities. If this is your first time visiting my channel, welcome. I'd love to have you as a subscriber. Hopefully I can bring some common sense back into the picture for you. That being said, I also want to take the time to talk about some of the matters that seem to be left out of the public discourse when it comes to items regarding the economy, markets, and most importantly, your portfolio and how you're planning for your own future, both financially and really kind of your mental planning. This week, China is back front center stage in the news. Trade war, there is the hot button item. That is the buzzword of, well, really the past 12 to 18 months. But it seems like this story is really coming to a head, at least in the last week, and that's on the heels of a breakdown in trade negotiations between DC and Beijing. There's a very important part of this story that you are not being told. I want to break that down for you, explain to you the implications of what China's bigger plan looks like, and I want to tell you about the aspects of the Chinese and American relationship that you're not seeing. No one's telling you about this. And if they are, you're having to go scrape the bottom dark corners and depths of the internet to find anybody who's willing to really talk about the bigger picture that's going to have a potentially large impact, not only on our current way of life as Americans, but also on the overall global economic sphere. Coming right up, I'm going to break down China, America, the economy, the markets, and why the trade games or war that we're currently fighting is really not a trade war at all. Alright, so Monday, May 6th, I believe, the markets were hit with really a kind of a backhanded slap as far as the talks about negotiations with Beijing or China and the tariffs, the trade war, all of these items that had kind of been put on the back burner because of the prominence of the Russia and Trump and Mueller and all of those working pieces. They kind of stole the stage for a while, but here we are again. China's back in the game. I mentioned Monday, May 6th. That's when we got news that the negotiations that had otherwise seemed to be going rather well maybe hit a little hurdle. Maybe there was a bump in the road. There wasn't a lot of information. Again, back on that Monday, there were a few tweets from our, commander-in-chief, tweeter-in-chief, president, who is never shy to get his opinions and feelings out there in the public forum as quickly as possible. But as information started to trickle out through the week, we saw that there was in fact a major breakdown in the negotiations. Why? What was going on? That came to be known as the week progressed. But I feel like there's still going to be a lot more information that's going to surface as time goes on. And that's part of the reason that this video has taken me a little bit of time to get out to you. Patience is a virtue, and it's also a virtue long lost in today's world. And oftentimes, while I'd love to strike while the iron's hot, I can strike with false information and lead you in the wrong direction, or I can wait until I have a confident amount of evidence or information available to really kind of weed through and sort out what may really be happening. And I'm glad that I did that this week, because not only did it further reinforce a larger, broader perspective or theory that I have on China right now, but it also gave a bit more information as it relates to the markets, the economy, what we're really looking at and what we need to be planning for as we look at the road ahead. So I mentioned on Monday, May 6th, I've said that a few times, just 2 days prior to that, the United States celebrated what in my house we consider to be a major holiday, which is the day of the Kentucky Derby. It was quite a race in that it had a controversial ending. There was an overturned decision as far as the winner. That's something that really does not happen a whole lot in that sport, and it came to be quite an interesting turn of events. But that being said, come Monday, we had another interesting turn of events, in that something that seemed to be pretty decided, or at least we were led to believe so. The market had priced in that there was going to be a pretty decent deal made with the US and China. That all of a sudden, there was a radical shift. The reason I bring the conversation about the Derby up is that if you think in terms of racing parlance, or just as far as just thinking about horses in general, you might be aware of the concept of blinders. I don't think that that's something that is outside of the lexicon of most Americans. We use that terminology to talk about all kinds of things, and that there's a lot of positive impacts that can be had from putting blinders on yourself. Let's say if you're trying to stay focused, you want to put the blinders on. You want to avoid looking at email pop-ups or Instagrams and Facebooks and all the other social medias or whatever it is. You want to try to keep yourself focused, and one of the best ways to do that is put various types of blinders on yourself. So those being self-imposed blinders, those are something that people can use to remain focused, to achieve a positive result. There's also blinders that we can have either placed upon us or put on ourselves, not by our own volition, or not under our own power. These are things that, let's say our parents have effectively raised us with certain blinders. They talk about the sheltered kids in the world that have never really seen what the real world looks like. Perhaps they have blinders on. Society has a funny way of putting blinders on us. Cultural blinders can be really a big deal. And in the case of the US and China, the reason I bring up the notion of blinders altogether is that what we're really dealing with is a case of Americans having significant cultural blinders on almost all of us. Now, I want to make a clear distinction here. These cultural blinders are not necessarily a bad thing. They're also not necessarily something that we can blame ourselves for. These blinders are placed upon us by virtue of being raised in the world that we live in. Everyone has these blinders placed on them. And blinders are impermanent. These are not aspects of each of us that are mandatory to remain on us for the rest of our lives. Eventually, you can reach a point where you can choose to remove the blinders. Without a doubt, the trade war that we are currently fighting, or that we are supposedly fighting with China, I would argue is not a trade war at all. I would suggest to you that instead we break down what a war is first. And once we define what a war is, you may agree. I think a good place to start when you're defining a war is let's de-escalate that terminology a little bit, and let's talk about just a simple game. In the grand scheme, a war is just a very big game with very significant consequences. But a game in general is something that humanity has engaged in really since the dawn of time, as far as humans are concerned. A game requires a few things, and war is not exempt. Game or war requires not only a player, but it requires an opponent. And that opponent doesn't necessarily have to be a equal party, or a party that shares the same characteristics as the player. Think of a computer, for example. If you're playing a video game or something like that, where you're playing the computer's not another human. It's a code, it's an algorithm, it's a piece of technology, but it's acting in the role of the opponent. If you were to say a game like golf, while yes, there are golf tournaments where players play each other on a scored basis, in truth, a player could technically play the golf course, and their challenge is simply between themselves and the course and the challenge that presents to the player. But ultimately, the player has to have a challenge in an opponent, and that opponent again can come in different shapes and forms. One of the other critical requirements for game is an agreed upon rule set or definitions in terms of not only how the game is played, but also what defines the winning and losing characteristics of the game. What aspects of the game or what accomplishments that can be made through that game would result in a win or a loss. A game doesn't even necessarily have to have a winner. That could be one of the defining characteristics of the game, is that there is no winner. In situations like that, that would be called an infinite game. So if I were to use, let's say, an attorney for an example. As an individual, that attorney gets up every day, and let's just say that they're going out and they're playing a game called life, okay? Now, hopefully I don't get hit by the Game of Life board game for stealing. That's not what I mean. But this thing that we're all playing, this life that we get up and live. Let's say that this attorney wakes up and they're going to a court case. Now, that specific case is a finite game. There's going to be a defined winner or loser of that particular game, okay? But being an attorney is an infinite game as far as the scope of that individual's life is concerned. For their own eternity, through the rest of their life, assuming they stay in that same career path, there's no winning at being an attorney. They can be a more successful attorney, but they might reach a level of success and they can always then lose. There's no referee at the end of it to say, blow the whistle, you are now the winner of attorney. So that's a smaller scale way of looking at infinite and finite in terms of games, and then again we can translate that out to wars. Now that's the key piece there, where you have to have an agreed upon term, and in terms of talking about the trade war. The terms of the game that the United States are playing, I would argue, are remarkably different than the terms on which China is playing as it relates to the economic and trade relations between the two countries. So, how did we get to where we are? We talked about blinders, right? And we talked about how we might be wearing cultural blinders as Americans. If we then say we're fighting a trade war, I'm arguing we're not fighting a trade war, and that's one of the repercussions of having our blinders on, is we're unable to see the fact that we are not playing on the same terms that the opponent that we perceive to exist is playing on. Therefore, that opponent does not exist in the scope of the war that we are currently fighting. But let's just start at 1776 for the sake of keeping scope in check, and say from that point forward, since the official founding of this nation, America has virtually only fought finite wars or finite games. This is a symptom of two things. It's a symptom of, one, the nature of us, the U.S., as a country, being so diverse. It's very, very difficult to play or to have an agreed upon infinite game or goal because of the differing opinions that we all have. The scale and the scope of our nation is not something that can really be confined to an agreed upon set of goals. And now is a better time than ever to really look at that and say, we've got these younger individuals who arguably are truly, it's ignorance in the textbook definition of they simply don't understand implications associated with what they feel to be idealized concepts. But those that are championing socialism, they're looking at the future of our country in one way, whereas those who are let's just use perhaps the extreme opposition to that might be libertarianism of sorts. Their viewpoint going forward is radically different, and it's going to be very difficult to even find common ground between those two parties on really much of anything. And even if a few of those individuals from each could agree, then there's the rest of the country that would also have to agree. So again, it's very difficult. Now, when you have a centralized government that's making all decisions for a country, no matter how many people there are, and better yet, if all of those people are somewhat homologous and very similar in background and culture and tradition and everything else, it starts to get a little bit easier to actually play infinite games. But the other factor, and the important factor as far as the ultimate decisions being made, has a lot to do with the fact that we do have two, I would suggest they may potentially be strengths in some regard, but as a whole, I would argue that they're actually weaknesses, or they have weaknesses. And that is to say that we have a two-party system politically, and we have term limits. And I want to put a quick disclaimer on the back of that. I don't suggest that term limits are bad. I really think that term limits are required, especially in America. But the aspect of term limits that is negative, if there is one, is that there is not a strong enough incentive for those who are in current position, those who have gained notoriety, or those who have gained an elected position that does have a term limit. There is no strong enough incentive for them to make decisions that would have positive ramifications or positive benefits in the plus 10, plus 15, and plus 20 year timeline. While some may be intrinsically motivated by the notion of leaving some type of legacy, in the grand scheme of things, and again, in the world that we're living in today that's so fast-paced, it's not so often that you get that. And to compound that notion, I would even suggest that the metrics by which we measure success, and this is the fault of the people. We've allowed this to happen. We get to choose how we measure people. And unfortunately, we spend a whole heck of a lot of time measuring them on immediate things that they're doing, rather than those big idea pieces that they claim they want to go do. But, in order for that to change, we would all have to agree, maybe we don't want the immediate benefit. Maybe we do, in fact, agree that we want some of these long-term benefits, but that's typically going to be contrasted by the fact that somewhere around 45 to 49% of the population opposes those grand schemes. So it takes me full cycle all the way back to the fact that we do tend to play finite games as a nation. Okay, so I mentioned that the two defining characteristics about the United States that makes it very difficult for the U.S. to engage in an infinite war or infinite game of any sort, that being the incredible diversity of people, but also that of the term limits and the de-incentivization in our political structure of long-term decision making for the benefit of the future of the nation, rather than the immediate benefit of said politician and their current agenda. So how do those two aspects or those two characteristics apply for China? The first, let's talk about the people of China. These are individuals that by and large, while yes, they are individuals, their background, their family heritage, their cultural heritage is much less diverse than the United States on a whole. Now, it's 2019. God knows I'm going to get ripped to pieces by somebody who wants to tell me how wrong I am, and by all means, you're more than welcome to. I'm simply looking at a direct comparison of the two countries, and on a whole, if I'm not talking about any one person or any, small group of people, but if we just look at the populations, generally speaking, the United States, the individuals of the United States have a more diverse background than do the population or the individuals in the population of China. So having that more common background and being raised with a higher level or higher degree of commonality between one another, there's a higher probability that they might agree on certain things to a greater fashion. There's also the big, I was going to say pink, but let's go with red elephant in the room, which is communism. It doesn't even matter what the people think, because at the end of the day, the government structure is capable of making decisions on behalf of the people without their consent necessarily. And for that reason, it just makes it that much easier to have an agreed upon set of long-term objectives or even infinite objectives, thereby allowing them to play an infinite war. So factor number 2, talking about the political structure, this is a very big key piece to the puzzle, in my opinion, and how this is going to relate into the overarching subject today, is that we're talking also about a people who effectively made the decision in, and I'm looking here at my notes, March 11th of 2018, the government decided to remove the term limits on the current president. Now, to me, that immediately means that he should no longer be called president. But the idea here is that all of a sudden, a country that actually did have term limits prior has removed that burden of let's say scope or perspective. I think it has removed the burden of perspective. So if China has in fact alleviated that challenge, and in combination with, again, the homologous, or at least pseudo-homologous nature, somewhat homologous nature of the people, they can play an infinite game. And as far as trade is concerned, that's exactly what they're doing. They're not here to play a game that they can win. They are here to play a game in which they become the leader and stay there as long as they possibly can. So let's go full circle all the way back now to my suggestion that we are not engaged in a trade war. We do not actually have a trade war happening right now, on the fundamental agreement or the belief that you would have to share with me that in order to have a war or a game of any kind, the two parties or three or multiple parties have to have an agreed upon set of rules and an agreed upon, in those rules, an agreed upon end result or measurement for success. Until we begin playing under the same agreed upon rules, or again with the same objectives as our perceived competitor, there's no way we're going to win. So that's where I want to bring in a deep dive discussion about what our competitor is doing. Some of you may already have become familiarized with the Belton Road Initiative, the BRI. This is the element of the relationships between China and the world and China and the US that I feel is not adequately covered in the mainstream media. The individuals who have been tapped responsible for sharing wisdom, knowledge, and information to the general public are failing miserably in discussing something that is far more critical to the well-being of the American population as we know it now. And this is something that has implications that are far-reaching, well beyond not only our immediate lives and livelihood, but our futures. And this is where, when you're thinking about your own, be it retirement, be it your own legacy, and looking at the potential for your assets to afford the next generation some type of benefit, or when you're just simply looking at your lifestyle and how you enjoy it today, these are all potentially at risk. And I'm not doing this or saying this to sensationalize it. In fact, I want to get away from that as far as I possibly can. What I do want to do, though, is say, look, the sensationalized nonsense that you're hearing about today, about trade war and tariffs, and oh my goodness, the consumers who pays for tariffs, and sure. But the implications of the bigger picture are far more broad reaching and far more severe. And the fact that policy decision making is not being centered around this, at least in the public forum, that should be worrisome to all of us. So, what is the Belton Road Initiative? I think the best way for me to highlight the Belton Road Initiative without actually putting any formal definition on it is to give you the following. Remember, just a moment ago, I explained that in 2018, the president of China, the Communist Party, removed term limits. He successfully alleviated term limits from his presidency. And that was in 2018. About a year earlier, in May of 2017, the Belton Road Forum was held. And this was something that China's not being secretive about this. This is not a Project Blue Book or something similar where it's kept in the deep, dark, secret files of the country. This is public information and encouraged to be public information, yet again, America's mainstream pundits, media, and experts, well, they may be experts in this particular subject, it's just not getting enough ground in the public forum. But at this Belt and Road Forum, President Xi outlined the 5 goals of this initiative. This is not something that's going to be achieved or he's trying to achieve in 1 year, 2 year, 3 or 4 year. This is a 20 to 25 year projected plan. And the 5 goals are policy coordination, and that is policy coordination with other nations. Facilities connectivity. They're wanting to create a new Eurasian continental bridge, which China, Mongolia, Russia, there's already an economic corridor there. They're wanting to expand upon that and bring the European nations into that corridor with literal connectivity for the sake of transportation, transit, and thereby trade. Financial connectivity is goal number 3. And they're wanting to effectively invest in and create new enhanced mechanisms for the infrastructure of their banking system and its ties to and relationship with these other nations where they're coordinating policy. They want people-to-people bonds. Okay, in a connected digital world, this is important. What they're really wanting is they want Chinese people engaging with people around the world aggressively. They want people from around the world coming into China. And as Americans know, one of the greatest strengths to our immigration policy, so long as they become tax-paying individuals who are enjoying the liberties and freedoms of our country and also sharing in the costs associated with having those, there are individuals from other nations that have brought tremendous strength to our own country throughout history and still today because they're able to come in and bring their ideas and their human capital to the American table, enhancing our overall economic, not only power, but our economic influence. And there's a really big one, the 5th item of the big 5 that President Xi outlined. Unimpeded trade. They want to surpass $50 billion in unimpeded trade. So that's their goal. So now you've got a long-range goal, very clearly defined objectives, an initiative rather than a policy or whatever it may be. An initiative is something that is to say this is much more philosophical, but it's got finite, hard figures that are trying to be achieved. And the timeline is far more than 4, 8, 10, or 15 years even. Alright, so I've outlined for you what the eternal president of the Communist Party has provided the 5 goals for the Belt and Road Initiative. I've outlined those goals. Let's take a look real quick here at, again, this is sourced from a Deloitte Insights report that they created on the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'm going to put a link to this down in the description below in case you want to go in and read a little bit further. But let's take a look at this map here, and what we can see is the original Silk Road for trade and commerce. This was really a revolutionary aspect of humanity. It revolutionized humanity. It revolutionized cultures, and it brought people together that had previously never known one another, and thereby allowed for, I would say, some really incredible advancements, because the sharing of ideas it opened up the eyes of so many. And we can see here that in the 21st century there's a maritime Silk Road. It exists. So when we look at this modern day 21st century maritime Silk Road, note the east coast of Africa. And something that's, I think, critical to understand here is that Africa plays a big role in the Belt and Road Initiative, because there's a lot of people there who, generally speaking, while they may view America in a positive light due to humanitarian aid and some of the other, truth be told, America's always treated them as though they are a charity case. And China's taken a very different approach in their dealings with Africa. By way of the Belt and Road Initiative, China has come in much more and presented themselves as a business partner. The privilege of having been a quote-unquote emerging economy not so long ago, the optics of who China is to the rest of the world, they come into Africa and they say, you know what, we've done it. We've got this booming, robust economy, and you can too. You know, they're kind of like the fitness trainer who used to be fat, and they walk up to the, look, I've been fat too, I know what it feels like, versus the fitness trainer who's always been thin and, you know, great physique, and the person who's sitting there saying, you can't relate to me. And China can relate to Africa in a sense, and they can definitely present themselves as such. So they walk into Africa and say that, and they say, because we understand you and we are where we are, we owe it to you to help you get to where we are too. Okay, so that makes a very compelling pitch. And then they say, they come into Africa and they say, you know what, we've done it. We've got this booming, robust economy, and you can too. You know, they're kind of like the fitness trainer who used to be fat, and they walk up to the, look, I've been fat too, I know what it feels like, versus the fitness trainer who's always been thin and, you know, great physique, and the person who's sitting there saying, you can't relate to me. You know, China can relate to Africa in a sense, and they can definitely present themselves as such. So they walk into Africa and say that, and they say, because we understand you and we are where we are, we owe it to you to help you get to where we are too. Okay, so that makes a very compelling pitch. And then they say, and we recognize that, you know, in order for you to grow in today's economy, you need a few things. You know, financing is a big deal. Then they'll also say, and you know, infrastructure. You need to build infrastructure. You know, you've got great cities, but you can make them better. Well, it just so happens that we've got plenty of companies who've over the past 20 years, they've made it in this business. They get it. They understand. So We've got financing. We've got the builders and the construction. And you know what? You need design and architecture. We've got that. You need banks. We can bring those in too. So you kind of see where it's going here. What that's doing is it's creating a perpetual indebtedness. Fashion, they create a dependence. And a dependence is a debt of a different kind. A dependence is a life and death debt. Once you become dependent on something, there's very few ways out of it. And when you're talking about financial dependence, if Africa becomes financially dependent on China, not only does China have power over them, but China also is able to ensure that they have a free trade agreement, and they also can ensure that they have a infinite buying population, because they can eventually sway the population of Africa. Again, if they're able to be successful in these endeavors, they're able to ensure that these individuals only trade with China. And China's not just winning on the trade game, they're winning on the resource game, because China is not exactly a resource-rich country. And in order to continue into a perpetuity state of growth and winship, a diverse and extensive resource pool is required. That's in talking to Africa. Doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the conversations with Europe. And most importantly, Russia and the Eastern Bloc nations, who again, resource rich. Let's back up. Stop talking so much philosophically, and let's talk about the current trade engagement. The trade war that the United States is currently engaged in with China. The United States is playing a short game. They're playing a game to win. They're playing a finite game, and they're playing a game that they're going to, and I keep saying they, but we as people are agreeing to what the policymakers in DC are aiming for here with their trade negotiations. And while the merits of their efforts are good, while their intentions are, I think, sound, their perspective is all wrong. And they're seeking to create equality in the trade negotiation, of the trade relationship between the US and China. Now that's important, because most Americans, and by God, anybody who's against this current trade war, trade debacle with China, if you're against the notion of engaging in this simply because right now you're being penalized, you clearly are not taking the time to learn about the relationship that China currently has with the United States in terms of trade. I think an important distinction to make, or an important clarification that a lot of people should become more educated about, is that in the rise of the Chinese economy as we know it today, it wasn't but 25 to 30 years ago that China was truly an emerging market. Okay, these are not developed economies when we talk about China. In the various facets that their economy as a whole has developed, these are very infantile in timeline despite their size. But unfortunately, the U.S. and I can almost place my tongue firmly in the cheek and say that there's a certain burden that the U.S. had for years, in that when emerging economies were wanting to do business with us, because we were the strongest and we held the most sway in the global environment, because once upon a time we had an agreed upon objective to stay in the leadership role. When emerging economies would start to surface, truth be told, we'd kind of treat them like a kid. we'd sort of say, yeah, okay, you can do whatever you want to us, and we'll still be nice to you. If you don't want to import our stuff, it's okay. You don't have a lot of money to import anyway. Blah blah blah. Okay, some economies never get out of that stage, and that's okay. We'll protect you. We'll help you. Be good to us. We'll be good to you. And there's always benefits. But the problem is when that emerging economy is no longer exhibiting characteristics of an emerging economy. When they become more mature, be it in their size or in their power or their maturity, you reach a point where you have to say, okay, I've raised you effectively, or I've granted you the freedoms to act however you may please, but now you're an adult, and now I need to treat you like one. It's time for me to start having expectations of you that are appropriate for where you are, and I'm going to have to treat you as an equal. That's what America has not done with China. We've continued to treat them with these kid gloves. We've continued to provide them with these freedoms and liberties that you might afford to a child simply because they're a child, whereas an adult, you can't let this stuff fly. And as far as the Trump administration, what they're really doing is they're looking to effectively win that little finite game. That finite game being, we want to level the playing field. And for that, they should be commended. For that, the short-term penalty of a tariff, if that is the way that we can get through to this other economy, that, hey, we can't stand for y'all not playing a level game here. When we say, okay, either drop your tariffs on our imports, or we'll put tariffs on yours. And they go, boo-hoo, boo-hoo. No, don't expect me to play by the rules. That should be troubling to most Americans, that's what they're doing. And if most Americans could get their heads out of their rear ends and stop looking at Trump as some person that they abhor, and just simply look at policies and say, okay, I don't care who does it, or maybe I care who does it, but let's not even talk about who's doing it. What policies are in our best interest as a country to provide for our needs as a people? That might be one where, hey, all we're doing is asking quid pro quo, fairness, and let's agree that the terms of the game, if there is an infinite game the U.S. is playing, it's the trade game. Let's make those rules fair again, because you're not this growing economy. You're the second largest economy in the world. Granted, your ability to monitor and maintain yourself might be a little bit wacky, and the fact that you play by your own set of rules, by currency manipulation and other, but at least as far as the freedom of trade, let's play by the same rules here. The intended consequence of leveling the playing field is met with a more significant unintended consequence that could very well be positive for the United States. And that would be that, again, while we're aiming for this death blow to level the playing field for trade, while we will never likely hit that, or even if we do, it's not going to address the larger issue. What it may potentially do is kind of maybe do a little crowbar to the kneecaps. It might slow down the bigger agenda in enough of a fashion that it would allow the United States to reevaluate not only policy but priority, and better equip ourselves to either negotiate successful terms for this further engagement of our relationship with China, or potentially better equip our arsenal of influence to ensure that we maintain our status as the leading nation in the world as far as policy, trade, and political influence. That's one that it kind of pains me to say, but at least from my vantage point right now, while this beautiful dream world of free trade between everybody and everybody's happy and there aren't any countries and there's no such thing and we're all just human beings coexisting together, it paints a pretty picture. But the harsh reality is that until human nature can be left behind in the dust, that's going to be a very difficult thing to achieve. But I think there is an outcome that is achievable that can provide the best of what's currently available in the event humankind can't shed its own nature and its drive for belongingness and tribalism and some of the things that really have cemented in, the whole concept of borders and nations and everything else. If we see that we as Americans and as America, which again, remember, a massive melting pot of ideas, people, backgrounds, cultures, but if we were to surrender our leadership role, and if in fact our sway in the public global forum were to be leapfrogged by China, whereas nation building and spreading democracy and some things that I think are, they'd be better off left on the sidelines in many cases. If that's our approach to taking on the world as the leader, what's China's approach going to be? It may not be as sweet, even if the United States is not the greatest in terms of imposing our will on others. I reckon to figure China's not going to present a much better picture unless, of course, you agree that you should hand over all of your personal liberties and power, ability to make decisions, simply give that to a consolidated group of people who can make decisions on your behalf and who can monitor your every move and who can rate you based on their belief system about your social standings and things that are void of individualism as a whole. If that's what you believe is great, then by all means, let's just surrender now. But I'd encourage you to respect the individual more than that. And one of the ways that we can do that is to ensure that the United States, or at least the belief system that currently obligates the United States to maintaining the democratic approach that we do, the fact that we have such a diversity, there's a requirement for that outlook to stay in the leadership role globally. Be thinking to yourself, why have I not heard of the Belton Road Initiative? What exactly is this? I want to go read more about it. And how could this affect the United States? I want to encourage you to consciously take off your blinders and start looking through the lens of the Chinese or the Chinese decision makers. If you knew that this was your end objective, would you be willing to make concessions? Would you be willing to give up some of your current tariffs that are placed on U.S. goods in order to prevent one of your main current income sources, which is the purchasing power of the United States consumer economy? Would you be willing to put those aside and potentially even import more U.S. goods in order to ensure that you maintain the incoming wealth that your exports are generating? Do you think that China is seeking the Belt and Road Initiative for power? Or do you think that they are doing so because it would allow for a free global economy to exist that they might agree with? Do you think that that coincides well with their belief in a communist-run state? Whew! Thank you so much for sitting through that with me. I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate you taking the time to sit with me as I talk through what I feel to be the bigger issue and clarify why it is I feel that we're not engaged in a trade war, or at least some of the nuanced elements of why this trade war is on track for a less than positive result if we don't adjust our perspective. I asked a few questions at the end, and I would love to hear your thoughts on things going forward. If you have some comments or feedback about these questions that I posited at the end, I'd love to hear about them in the comments section down below. I'd also love it if you could take a minute to like this video. That helps me out a ton. And if you feel like someone else might benefit from hearing this perspective on matters with China, please do share this. Thank you again. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I will look forward to part 2 coming up soon.